I have the honor of introducing my talented and radiant friend, Becca, who, like white light through a prism, diffracted, shines forth as a scholar, a harpist, a poet, a painter, and a heroine of the imagination. All of these feats will be on display this week. I encourage you to go to the gallery and see Becca's paintings. But more than this, Becca is a wonderful friend and was one of the first people to really welcome me into the community and help me find my place here. And whether it's being a partner in crime at these 3-day dance parties, or my partner in texting each other bad puns while we're both procrastinating our papers, or helping me see my soul reflected in the sacramental sky. Becca helps us all revision the world through enchanted eyes. Please continue.
Wow, thank you so much, Travis. So I have to start by asking, please raise your hand if, before looking at the schedule, you had ever heard of Anne Conway. Oh wow, I'm impressed. Okay, that's more than I was expecting. Okay, raise your hand if you know anything about her. Okay. So I've been thinking a lot in the last few years about what it means to be a woman in philosophy, what it means to be a woman in philosophy today, and what it has meant over these past centuries as philosophy has developed, especially in the West. So today I'm going to talk to you about Lady Anne Finch, who was the Viscountess of Conway. She lived in the 17th century. She was a younger contemporary of the Cambridge Platonists and learned philosophy in correspondence with the Cambridge Platonist Henry More. And she learned philosophy by reading Descartes, who was, he was the cutting edge. This was new material that she was working with. But she learned his philosophy not as dogma, but as something to work with and work against, and ended up developing her own philosophical system. It's a 70-page treatise that's the only work of hers that we have published. And this treatise actually articulates a natural mysticism that seems to be very close to what we are creating here in PCC. So I find her work to be extremely relevant to what we're doing. And that she is a woman whose name has been buried in the patriarchal tide of history, I also find significant. Because her work has influenced, and I'm sure you'll recognize these names, Leibniz, Blake, Goethe, Bergson, Whitehead, actually I don't even want to say many, but several contemporary feminist and ecological thinkers such as Carolyn Merchant. But we don't hear about her. The only person really who kind of acknowledges her influence was Leibniz, who got his idea of monads from her. And all other references to her work, her name has been buried and lost, in part because it was initially misreferenced and given. Her work was published by one of her mentors, and it was attributed to him. And so then that lineage was lost and is only recently being uncovered. But to give you an idea of the significance of this woman in her lifetime and the impact she had on the all-male philosophers in her life, she held philosophical salons in her bedroom, actually, because she suffered from incapacitating headaches, and so she could not leave her room for much of, especially her later life. And she would hold these salons in her bedroom in this very intimate, dark space. And all of these men who learned with and from her were in awe of who she was. Her teacher and colleague in many ways, or would be if she'd been allowed to go to Cambridge, Henry More, dedicated one of his books to her, and he described her in this way. He said, "She's one whose genius I know to be so speculative and wit so penetrant that in the knowledge of things as well natural as divine, you," he's addressing her directly, "you have not only outgone all of your own sex, but even of that other also, whose ages have not given them overmuch the start of you." So in his work with her and teaching her, he could see what a brilliant person she was and really held her in reverence for how she shone. Conway was influenced by a diversity of sources, from Plato and Origen to Jacoboma to Quakerism. She converted to being a Quaker later in her life, which was very radical for the time, as well as the Lurianic Kabbalah. So she integrated occult knowledge, alchemy, ancient wisdom, and this new mode of organizing reason that was represented by the mechanists, also known as science, integrated all of these streams together. Her philosophy has been described as a cross-fertilization of Cartesianism and Platonism. And yet it's also a critique. It's a critique of Descartes and Hobbes, and also of Spinoza. So it's a critique of dualism, and it's also a critique of monism. And she's also even critiquing some of her teacher, Henry Moore's work as well. One of the very few books that's dedicated completely to Anne Conway's work is written by a woman, Carol Wayne White. The book's called The Legacy of Anne Conway, Reverberations from a Mystical Naturalism. And I thought this quote captured somewhat of what this philosophical system is that Conway created. White writes, "She, Conway, introduced a conceptualization of processional nature that is measured and authorized by the worth of ancient and marginalized wisdoms. The result is a unique Christian cosmology, or mystical naturalism, that affirms a continuum of life-affirming impulses, stretching from God through the most inconspicuous minutiae of perceived materiality." So, and what's amazing is that this 70-page treatise she wrote is the fullest philosophical system written in English by a woman in the 17th century. Just these 70 pages that didn't even have her name on it when it was published. So I'm going to lay out a little bit what this continuum is that she's describing in her metaphysics. She talks about the three species of existence. She sees all of existence as one continuum, and it might help to picture this like a spectrum of light, from the brightest light going into dimness. So if you just kind of hold that image, it might help. So they divide that light into three parts, these three substances of existence: God, Christ, and she has a very different conception of Christ than was orthodox for her time, and creation, or creatures. So to look at the first one, God. She writes, "In God, there is no time, change, arrangement, or division of parts. God is also, in a true and real sense, an essence distinct from his creatures." So it's a continuum, but there's distinction. "Distinct from his creatures, although not divided or separate from them, but present in everything, most closely and intimately in the highest degree." So God is not separate dualistically, but as one end of this infinite continuum, or this infinite spectrum of light, is differentiated from the opposite end. And then the second species is what she calls the middle nature, or the Messiah, or the Christ. She draws on the Kabbalah as well as an influence for this, referring to this middle nature as Adam Kadmon, and so on. So and this is also a Kabbalistic idea, that God, for the sake of God's creatures, diminishes God's light. And in this diminished light generates, or naturally emerges, this middle nature, the Messiah, the Christ. And she sees Christ as this necessary mediator between God and the creatures. And that, well, let me read this quote of hers, and I think this will kind of capture it. "The first concept is the infinite God himself, considered above and beyond his creation. The second is the same God, insofar as he is the Messiah. The third is the same God, insofar as he is with the Messiah in his creatures. So you can see this kind of fading continuum, and yet it is all unified. So all three of these substances share spirit in common, and yet they're infinitely differentiated in relation to, they're differentiated based on their relationship to mutability, so based on their relationship to change. So I'm going to kind of explain this by this breakdown of the three again. So back to God. God is immutable. God does not change. God is in time, but not bound by time. So God is completely perfect, and in that cannot move toward greater perfection. So there is no movement or change whatsoever in God. You could say that God is eternally at eternity. Now the creatures are in time and bound by it. So they are mutable. They are susceptible to change. And they can change both toward goodness and toward evil because we have free will. And this is kind of an interesting part of her system, that in a way she doesn't see God as having completely free will, because God is bound by God's goodness, whereas the creatures are mutable toward good or evil. That is our choice, our free choice. So she writes, God is both a most free agent and a most necessary one, so that he must do whatever he does to and for his creatures, since his infinite wisdom, goodness, and justice are a law to him which cannot be superseded. So God is bound by this goodness. So then back to the middle nature, the Christ. Christ is a combination of these two. Christ is mutable like creatures, able to change, but only towards goodness. So Christ is constantly in this process of always moving toward perfection, always moving toward goodness. She writes, Christ cannot become evil, but he can become good, and consequently he partakes both of divinity and creatureliness, as well as eternity and time. So she's clear that this isn't pantheism, and she's doing this kind of refutation of Spinoza. This isn't pantheism because sin, quote, sin and devils would be nothing but parts or the slightest modification of this divine being. But it's also not dualism, because Christ is this mediator between God and creatures. Mediator that participates in both divinity and in creatureliness. So I'm going to leave these two. I'm drawing this out in the air. I'm going to leave God and Christ for a little bit and move to this third substance, which is creation. And this also is a spectrum and can be seen also as a continuum. So you can hang on to this metaphor of the light to the darkness. And it's a continuum from spirit to matter. And she sees this as a way to explain how the body relates to the soul. So she's doing this as a direct response to Descartes. She sees the body as a dimmed form of spiritual light. And then she sees the spirit as subtle body. And the reason she explains it this way is because she doesn't understand how the body and the soul would be able to interact if they were fundamentally different, as Descartes and others hold. So she actually described her philosophy as an anti-Cartesianism, holding this question: how can body and soul interact? Because Descartes said the body is impenetrable and divisible, whereas the soul is penetrable and indivisible. How can these two interact? And she uses this metaphor of iron and says that if you take a piece of iron and you try and have another piece of iron interact with it, they're never going to penetrate each other. They're never going to meet. But if you have another form of substance that is more subtle, like fire, then it is able to completely enter and fill the iron. And that's this metaphor she uses for the soul and the body, that they are both of one kind, but subtle compared to gross. She also says that the spirit and the body are drawn together because they love one another, because they are similar. It is their similarity that draws them together. And yet, she also describes it that the body is a mirror for the spirit. And it's the body that has to be opaque, that has to be of this kind of dimmed spiritual quality so that it can act as a reflection of the spirit back to it. And that is how we retain memory and our personality and so on. So it's this mirroring and this relationship that happens. And she sees relationship as essential to this process, that relationship can only happen when there's similarity, so they can interact, and difference, so they're different enough that they can actually be far apart enough from each other they can have a relationship. And she sees this as necessary for the movement and evolution of created substance towards perfection. So this continuum that I have been talking about, I titled this talk The Infinite Dynamic Stairway, because it's kind of like this constantly moving staircase. And the idea is that the staircase itself is infinite, but the steps are finite. And so as created creatures, we can move up these steps. And she did posit an idea of metempsychosis, or transmigration of souls, from one lifetime to the next. And you would move up or down the stairs based on your behavior in your life. And it's interesting, she says that not only one's behavior towards other human beings, but towards animals, towards all creatures. And she emphasized this, that would shape who we become in our next lifetime and if we would move up or down this staircase. And she says that creatures can move up the staircase infinitely. It's an infinite staircase, but never to the point of reaching God. So never to the point at the end of this continuum, but there is no end of this continuum because it's infinite. So she's kind of holding these paradoxes, saying that God is infinitely greater than the infinite potential of God's creatures, in the way that one infinity is greater than another. One infinity is greater than another infinity, and that's how she holds the difference, and yet constant movement toward goodness, toward perfection. And a metaphor that I think maybe helps describe this is, if you think of a geometrical shape with an infinite number of sides, it's still never going to be a perfect circle. And that is the difference between the infinite potential of creatures moving towards goodness and the already non-moving perfection of God. So because this is a continuum, she and everything that is created participates in God, then everything that is in God is in a way given to what is created. So she is saying that matter cannot be considered to be dead and inert, as Descartes was saying, because there is nothing in God that is dead or inert. And so that is not possible for what is created. And what this does is that she's suggesting that there is life all the way down, all the way through all of created existence. And this is why ecological thinkers have drawn on her work, those who've started to uncover it, because it is this idea that everything that is created participates in this divinity, and that we cannot treat matter as something that is meaningless and dead because it is imbued with that divinity that is given to it by being of one ultimate substance. So I actually just want to wrap up here with this quote from, again, Carol Wayne White, who in this sentence I feel kind of captures what Conway was articulating, but also I think relates it to what we're doing in PCC. She writes, "For Conway, the love among all creation constitutes a sacral universe where the shared love among all entities is based on a processional view of natural phenomena participating in the divine life. So for Conway, the love among all creation constitutes a sacral universe where the shared love among all entities is based on a processional view of natural phenomena participating in the divine life. Okay, thank you. We got a few minutes for questions, yeah.
So, as much as I don't want to obviously pie into gender differences, the fact that there's been one text written by a female in how many thousands of years makes it obvious that there are differences. So, within that, what do you think that women can contribute that is then different than what has been contributed thus far?
This is the scariest question.
Or maybe more personally, what would you like to
Contribute.
You know?
That's the thing when I think about, I mean, I have really struggled in my time in PCC with the idea of philosophy, and often feeling like I still don't know what philosophy is. And I think part of that is just me and my kind of struggle with that, but I do sometimes question, okay, who created what we call philosophy? And yes, it is predominantly white males. And I sometimes wonder, can I not get in there? Can I not get a hold because I'm a woman or because I am myself? And I think to answer your question, it is important to bring in more women's voices so that we can know what women can contribute before saying what they should contribute because they're women. And when I discovered, Jake brought Anne Conway into our soul class last spring, and when I read these 70 pages, I felt like I had a foothold. And is that because she's a woman or because this is a particular individual with whom I resonate? And I don't actually want to answer that. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, I felt like when I read her philosophy, I had a ground to be able to interact with other philosophies in a way that I couldn't before. There are things that about her biography that definitely contribute to her philosophy. For example, as I said, she was in severe physical pain for much of her life. She had these debilitating headaches. And this is what gave her the idea that there is a unity between soul and body because of this experience of pain. She says that, this is a quote from her, "Why does the spirit or soul suffer so with bodily pain? For if, when united to the body, it has no corporeality or bodily nature, why is it wounded or grieved when the body is wounded, whose nature is so different?" So she's saying this directly to Descartes, basically. "If one says that only the body feels pain, but not the soul, this contradicts the principle of those who affirm that the body has no life or perception." And so she's drawing on that personal experience. And that's just her biography. She could have been male or female with that. I hope that answers a little bit. No more questions? Yes. Matt.
I'm just curious how you either resonate or if you feel any sense of resistance to her theology, and if what drew you into her thought was not necessarily the specifics of it, but just the continuity. Or I'm just curious, like, how you perceive her attempts to bring creation and the creator with the mediator together into that sort of theological picture, and how it resonates with you or not.
Yeah, I think what I'm drawn to is this idea of a continuum, but that, I mean, she had, like, Carolyn Merchant critiques her, saying that what she's really doing is she's collapsing all reality into the idealist category of spirit. But I actually think what is happening is a little more subtle than that, and that she is, I mean, you could see it as a collapse, except that she's built all these structures within this single substance. And what's important for her is not necessarily what something is, but how it expresses itself. And that's what defines where something is along this continuously moving continuum. And I think that's the idea that I'm drawn to, that she's holding this tension of these structures within unity, and neither really can be collapsed, otherwise you're not telling her story anymore.
It's interesting the way, I mean, you described that she's more focused on how things express themselves than what they are.
Yeah.
Sounds a lot like Spinoza. And it's interesting that she's able to critique, you know, she drew from Descartes, she drew from Spinoza, even while she critiqued them at the same time. And I think that's something unique about her, that a lot of other philosophers have trouble sometimes. There's a tendency to want to say, these guys had it wrong, and here's the way it really is.
Yeah, I mean, she does use the term anti-Cartesianism to describe what she's doing. So there is a certain rejection there, but she learned philosophy actually by these correspondence letters with Henry Moore, and she learned philosophy by reading Descartes and discussing it in letters with Henry Moore. So it is fundamental to her philosophy.
Do we know much about her religion and religious practice?
Yeah, she later in her life converted to Quakerism, which was pretty unusual for the time.
Raised an Anglican or
I believe so.
Okay.
Do you
Did she have a Kabbalistic teacher for 10, 15 years? We're talking about the big class. Unless I'm way off base.
Yeah, one of her
Teacher in Kabbalah.
one of her mentors was what's his Francis von Helmont.
Yes.
And he was like both a teacher and a peer. And he's the person who's responsible for making sure that her work was published. But of course, he's also the one who, he published her piece in between two of his own, and that's why it was quickly attributed to him and not to her. Yes?
I'm really curious about what evil is for her. Like what, I don't know if that's an epistemological question but she was differentiating between good and evil, so I'm curious what evil is.
She was influenced by Origen, who was actually kicked out of the church for his ideas on evil, and that, I never know how to pronounce this word, is it apokatastasis? That basically the idea that everything ultimately will be saved, including Satan. And so her idea and this kind of processional idea is that everything moves out and away from evil, and that it's a mode of expression and not a permanent way of being.
So everything is held in this container of goodness because it is at all, and life has been breathed into it, but then...
By God, who is bound by goodness.
But then within the life of a thing, it can move from not enhancing life, or, you know, like what is evil? Like, I guess that's
What is evil?
That's
I'll just answer that in one sentence and we'll move on. I don't know. Yeah. But I guess I can just emphasize that it's this idea that it's an expression, it's a temporary way of being, and that it's a free choice. So, yes.
I just want to reflect back to you that your very search for philosophy is philosophy. That if you think about it, at the very root of philosophy, we have Pythagoras speaking about love for wisdom. And at the very foundation of philosophy, we have eros and logos joined together in a sacred marriage, and that we're still trying to figure out what that means for us. My favorite definition that I also got from Pythagoras is that philosophy is the care of the soul. And in that way, you are contributing with your own care for your soul to the field that we call philosophy. So have no fear, just start enjoying that process.
I'll call you next time I have a meltdown because I can't write a paper on philosophy. Yeah. Oh.
Can you say a little bit more about the connection to monads? Does she have like a fundamental unit?
Can I do this? And I'm at time, but let's talk more. I've got 30 seconds. Okay, 30 seconds. This idea of the infinite spectrum continues, and she sees everything as infinitely divisible, all the way down. But she also emphasizes that God, because God is bound by goodness, would not infinitely divide us up, because then the motion would stop and we would not be able to move towards goodness. But this idea that everything can be broken down into monads as a potential is part of the basis of it, I believe. But I would ask someone who knows more about that.